Okay, so if we talk about leases, leases can be divided into two categories, operating or capital leases, and the accounting treatment is different for each type of lease. So an operating lease, which is what I have here, is basically a rental agreement. We are granted the use of a particular asset for the duration of the lease in exchange for regular payments. And then we have capital leases here, which is effectively we're financing the purchase of a long-term asset. And as I mentioned earlier, the accounting treatment for each one of those two is different. If we're going to do an operating lease here, we would just debit the lease or rent expense and actually credit cash. If we have what's called a capital lease, then we actually debit the asset and we credit lease payable because it's more like a purchase. We also have to record depreciation on that particular asset. And the reason is because as this last bullet point states here, the capital lease is in essence, we are buying that particular asset. And there's 4 criteria that exist to determine whether or not an item is classified as a capital lease. So if any one of the following conditions exists, we have to record it as a capital lease. The lease transfers ownership of the property to the lessee. So at the end of the lease, the buyer is going to take ownership. The lease contains a bargain purchase option. So at the end of the lease, you can buy it for $5 or $100 or whatever it might be. The lease term is equal to 75% or more of the economic life of the leased property. Or the present value of the lease payments equals or exceeds 90% of the fair market value of the leased property. Under any of these conditions, you're essentially buying the lease or buying the asset. And if that's the case, again, we're going to debit the lease equipment and we'll credit the lease liability here. Here's a quick question just to see if you can determine the difference. So the renting of an apartment, would that be a capital lease, a lease liability, operating lease, or a lessor lease? And the actual answer is going to be it's an operating lease. Again, we're not taking ownership of that more than likely at the end of the lease term. So we're just renting it for a specific amount of time for a specific payment.